I had a very traditional manuscript of over 90,000 words when all was said and done by 2016. And it was really long-winded and boring and flat, and I hated it, and I didn't want to read it. So how would anyone else ever want to read it? And I hired a developmental editor who gave me a lot of feedback. And one of the last things she said was, put it away for a while. Just let all of this sink in. And I think that was the best advice she gave me.
Welcome to the book I had to write. I'm Paul Zakshevsky. Back in 1989, a young American named Jennifer traveled to Israel, where she fell in love with a French guy named Philippe. Though they were both 23 and Jewish, they led really different lives. She was secular, he was becoming deeply observant. She loved Israel but missed the US. He loved Israel but missed France. And so for the next 20 years, they continued to uproot their lives, all the while trying to find a place they could call home. That's the basis of a new memoir called Places We Left Behind. It's by today's guest, Jennifer Lang. In my interview with Jennifer, we talked about journeys, both the journey of her marriage and the journey of figuring out the story she most wanted to tell in this book. We talk about playing with structure and language, how she took what was a 90,000-word draft, one that she calls conventional and boring, and turned it into this 14,000-word concise jewel of a book. And we discuss what it's like to write about other people, specifically your husband, and how his reactions actually ended up surprising and helping her. Jennifer Lang lives and works in Tel Aviv, where she runs the Israel Writer Studio. A quick note, we recorded this interview back in February when Jennifer was here in the United States on book tour. I think it would be really disingenuous not to acknowledge the way that the world has become highly polarized around Israel's actions in Gaza, even more so in the time since this interview was recorded. At the same time, my goal with this podcast is to present literary conversations that expand our thinking. I found Jennifer's thoughts about craft and the way Israelis are viewing the current conflict really enlightening. I hope you get as much out of the conversation as I did, and thanks again for listening. Jennifer, welcome. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's lovely to be here.
I thought I could start us off by asking why this, Places That We Left Behind, why this was the book you had to write.
I've been getting that question a lot. So there's no the, it's just Places We Left Behind. And I think, writer to writer, this is the answer. I have been writing around it for years, if not decades. I have been writing about longing, belonging, culture, language, community, other, and home, in short, in long, in essay, in short memoir, in flash. I just kept going around and around, and I finally had time to figure out how to get through it.
So the book feels to me like it's really a study of what it's like to live in between cultures, kind of what you just mentioned a moment ago. It spans what feels like most of your adult life. And as I said, kind of what it means to bounce between at least 3 different cultures. Can you say more about that?
I really feel like the story of me bouncing between cultures starts way back, like kindergarten way back. I grew up Jewish in a very non-Jewish part of Northern California, a small city called Piedmont, encircled by Oakland on all sides. And in the 1970s, my parents always said there were less than 10% Jews, but I'm convinced it was less than 5%. And we didn't grow up religious. We grew up as strongly identified Jews and Zionist, because my dad's aunt and uncle had moved. The family had come from Romania to San Francisco in the 30s, and in 1947, 2 of my grandmother's siblings had gotten on a boat and immigrated to pre-state Israel, arriving in 1948. So my childhood, it was infused with stories from Israel, supporting my great-aunt and great-uncle, visiting my great-aunt and great-uncle. But I didn't grow up in a God-fearing household. I didn't grow up with belief in God, even. I grew up eating shrimp and cheeseburgers and pork chops and everything that somebody who's an observant Jew does not eat. I grew up, never went to school on the major holidays of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and I had to go to my teacher crying every September to say, I have to miss the test. And they had no clue what I was talking about when I told them why. And then along comes Thanksgiving, and then we'd start singing Christmas carols for the next 4 or 5 weeks, and I would go to my music teacher and say, can we sing a Hanukkah song? And she would say, tell me one. And so my story really starts there, but in kindergarten, my mom came into my classroom in December with a griddle, with mix of potato pancakes, with a ladle, with a menorah and candles, and a book about Hanukkah, and she read the story of Hanukkah to my very non-Jewish classmates and started to share our differences. And she continued on into elementary school. But the thing is I woke up one day, I don't know how old I was, 4th grade, 5th grade, 3rd grade, where I said, enough. Because I had realized nobody's mom came in to talk about the story of Christmas. That was just assumed. We all knew it. So being between cultures started there.
The book also feels to me like it's kind of a study in, I'm going to call it maybe a divided self. You have a quote, there's the one who craves newness and the one who wants or needs structure and control. Can you say more about that aspect of the book?
I mean, I think I still wrestle with it. I want to be that person who just can say, let's go travel for a year, or I signed up to do the Peace Corps. I applied to do the Peace Corps back in college, when I wasn't sure where I was going after graduation, and got to that second interview and I was like, I can't do this, and I backed out. That struggle is still really in me. I love being at home where I can control my chaos or control the chaos, and I love to then go and explore. And it's kind of like, how do you look at it? Is it that they have to be at odds, or do they just live within me and coexist, sharing the same space? And it's the latter. It's for sure the latter.
I mean, that answer kind of suggests to me yet another theme I wanted to bring up, which is just that the book is a lot about distances of all sorts, as you're talking about, including what feels like in some ways the biggest distance, which is navigating a long-term intimate partnership. And I was really interested in reading your book just as a study in negotiating a marriage, in which two partners start from pretty different places. So I wondered if you could talk a bit about that aspect of the book.
It's funny to realize what didn't get in, what never was in the book, that I start to realize now maybe should have been clearer in the book. So we came from different places. My husband is a French Jew from the northern area of Alsace. But here's the thing. I took French all of my life, minus 2 years. I started when I was 6. I went all the way through college. I did my junior year in Paris. I lived with a French family that year. I went back to college in America. I graduated. I went back to Paris. I lived on my own, and I completely immersed, and I had a job actually in a Jewish nonprofit. So by the time I met him, French came out of my mouth before anything else. He spoke French 100% of the time in our early days, in our early years. I knew his culture very, very well. It was kind of one-sided. I knew where he was from. I knew his culture. He didn't know mine. But we had a lot in common. So we both went to public school. We both went to Hebrew school. We both went to co-ed youth groups and Zionist summer camp. We both had traveled a lot. We both spoke other languages. We both had the same family structures. Our parents were the same age. Both liked the color apple green. Neither of us could sleep with a clock ticking on the wall. We both rode bikes and skied and played board games and were competitive and hiked and read books and went to the movies. We had a lot in common. So, yes and no. The distances were not as great as it might sound.
I mean, that definitely comes through in the book, and I'm not even sure how to say this. It's interesting. It's like trying things that were deeply familiar in one way and yet very new in another.
So I think the greatest difference between us had more to do with how to be a Jew in the world. And it became our incredible power struggle. And, it could have broken us. 6 months before I met him in Israel, and 6 months before meeting him, he had decided to increase his level of Jewish observance and to start observing the Sabbath, which means from Friday night to Saturday night, no electricity, no cooking, no driving, no spending money, we didn't have computers, no phones, no movies, no TV, none of that. it wasn't 100% foreign to me as much as it was 100% negative to me. And the reason it was negative is because I have one sibling who had already become what is today called ultra-Orthodox. And when my sibling did that, he brought it back to my family of origin, our family of origin, in a very not nice way. And all of this predates my meeting my husband. So by the time I met my husband, when 2 months into our relationship, the summer we were living together, he asked me if I could do Shabbat his way. I, on the one hand, said, I can try. And on the other hand, I had my guard up because I knew what he was saying. And I didn't want to. But I was young, and I was in love, and I was a woman. And I said, I can try. And for me, that's where the problem started, is because I gave up my voice. I gave up on myself, on my identity, way too quick.
You know, we're talking now at the end of February, so about 5 months out from the Hamas terror attacks of October 7th. And well, I guess the first thing I want to ask is just how you and your family are doing.
Thank you. We're okay. In a strange, weird way, we're very untouched because my kids were not called up to reserves for different reasons, because we don't connect firsthand to a hostage. On the other hand, we're all touched. The whole country is just, the level of pain, trauma, loss is so beyond. I don't know how we're going to get out of it. And I'm at the end of a month of being away, and it's been really, really good to be away, because I have that ability to be away because I don't have a kid who has been called up to reserves, and right? It's all connected.
You mentioned that you've been here for the past month. Obviously, everything right now is incredibly contentious, and I don't know what things will look like when this podcast comes out, but at the moment, they certainly feel very difficult. What is it you feel like maybe Americans are not understanding about what it feels like in this moment from your perspective as someone living in Israel? What do you feel like is there a disconnect in kind of what you see happening or hearing here versus what it feels like on the ground there?
I don't want to alienate anyone, so I'm going to try and really watch my words. I think the hardest part of this, well, there's two parts. One is, why all of a sudden do so many people, particularly in my country of birth, have such a strong opinion about the tiniest country possibly on the planet and one of the most complex histories? Why? That would be my first question. Secondly, do all of those people know that complex history? Or are they just looking at 2023? So please, before you shout your opinion, please know the history. And I don't mean even just since 1948. I mean, go back in time. 2, I guess I have more than that to say. 3, I think how people aren't able to separate Hamas from the Palestinian people boggles my mind. And again, people should be scouring for information from, let's say, Palestinians who are suffering under Hamas rule. And there are many starting to speak out. How smart people don't see that this is a terrorist organization, similar to the one that attacked on 9/11 in America, is beyond me.
So I want to shift gears, and I want to ask you more about the book itself. It's subtitled A Memoir-in-Miniature, and so it's a fragmented memoir in fragments. And, you know, I had the writer Abigail Thomas on my show actually very early on, and one of my favorite all-time books is Safekeeping. And I just love this form, and I guess I'm really curious to ask you about how you landed on it.
Yeah. Funny. My next book coming out in October is called Landed. So the first thing is, and I'm just going to say her name again, I was in conversation over a week ago at a bookstore in LA called Zibby's Bookshop. I was in conversation with Blair Glazer. She calls these chapterettes. And I was like, I am lifting that. So they're not vignettes, they're not fragments, they're chapterettes. I came to it, not in a straight line, because I'm not sure if any writer has the story of writing a book straight. It is so circuitous and long, and the story started 7 years ago back in graduate school, working with a mentor who encouraged me to separate an essay I'd written about running for shelter in 1991 during the first Gulf War, and he had encouraged me to separate what's called the sealed room from my marriage, and to give more space to my marriage in my writing because my marriage was interesting. And that was like really eye-opening for me, because for me, just my marriage sometimes felt downright hard. And I was like, what are you saying? And I spent the next few months in the margins saying, why? What? And then I also went to my husband to say, hey, can I try to write our story? And, there's a big difference between writing our story and a book coming out. And not only is it in 7 years, but it's in just the shock of it to the husband, because we are still married. In this really long 7-year story of writing. I don't even know how many times I put the manuscript away, but I had a very traditional manuscript of over 90,000 words when all was said and done by 2016, and it was really long-winded and boring and flat, and I hated it, and I didn't want to read it, so how would anyone else ever want to read it? And I hired a developmental editor who gave me a lot of feedback, and one of the last things she said was, put it away for a while. Just let all of this sink in. And I put it away. And I think that was the best advice she gave me.
So what changed for you?
In the putting it away, so much happened. I took a class on fast flash writing. So most people think of it in flash fiction, but I'm the flash nonfiction woman. So everything I wrote in this class, pre-COVID, asynchronous, online, with a group of total strangers, mostly Americans, was all about my life in Israel. And the feedback was, wow, fascinating. I hope you're writing a memoir about your life in Israel in Flash. So it really, went from there. Then I answered a call for a British journal called Dyslexia. It was a call for submissions. The story was J is for ... 300 words max. And I knew exactly what word I wanted in my story. It didn't make it into Places We Left Behind, but I still know the word and why I know the word. It was jury, about my husband and I sitting 2 days after our 20th wedding anniversary in White Plains, New York, in our sunroom. Our kids were all out of the house, deliberating like a jury of two, should we stay together or not? Should he and my son leave for Israel, and my girls and I stay in New York? And I found the word jury buried in thousands of words of a chapter. And I chiseled and cut and copied and pasted and started a new document, and I wrote J is for jury in under 300 words. And that writing sizzled. It completely changed. So the sparseness changed the whole thing.
It also sounds like the constraint of having to write a flash really pushed you.
Yeah. And I didn't want everything to be the same in the book. It's so not the same because I used images as well, symbols and images. But I was very cognizant of that I didn't want every chapter to have the same word length, word count.
Yeah, the book is, another aspect of it, apart from the fact it's got, I guess we're going to call them chapterettes, it's very playful. There's playfulness in the typography. There's kind of line breaks that look like a prose poem sometimes. I think there's an illustration, or at least a table. And then you make use of strike-throughs to suggest thoughts that you're having, but maybe don't want to talk out loud. How did introducing that sense of playfulness shift your writing? First of all, how did you come across it? How did you think about it? And how did it shift things?
I think everything is in writing with constraints, number one, and number two, read the submission guidelines. So while I was reading the submission guidelines, while I was submitting a super boring, 10,000 word manuscript for actually prose CNFs, creative nonfiction prose chapbook competitions, that's originally how this started, but this is a full book. I came across the words open to experimental prose. And I was like, wow, what does that mean? It just all of a sudden became apparent. I'd probably been reading it elsewhere and not paid attention. And I remembered an earlier reader of an earlier draft wishing she could have seen my pro-con list. Should I move in with my boyfriend or not? And I went back and recreated the pro-con list, and it started there. And it was so fun what I did in the end, and I love that you use the word, Paul, playful, because that's exactly how I see it. And that playfulness mirrors my marriage. We've always been flirtatious, playful, competitive. Our relationship started by playing backgammon in the hills of Jerusalem. We carry a deck of cards with us when we travel. And so I love that playfulness because it also kind of lightens the story in a way.
Hugely. I mean, it the theme is deep and serious, but the playfulness kind of lets the reader really get into things. The book is also very short. I think 13,000 words. You mentioned you originally had
14. Yeah.
14. Okay.
Yeah.
14,000 words. It sounds like it was cut down from 90,000 originally.
Well, that's a complicated question also.
Well, so this is what I wanted to ask, though. What about the brevity attracted you?
Everything. I don't have ADD, ADHD. I don't have any of that stuff. I'm like, that's not my issue. But I've definitely found that longer writing isn't always better. At least with my writing. I get too lost. And again, I think that when we write long, or when we write without any kind of constraint, we are lazy with our word choice. And so putting the constraint on makes a writer understand that every word counts. So we can say it, we can teach it, but until you start to put it into practice somehow, which I think comes straight from word count constraint, I got it. My prose started to shift in a way like I can't go back. I can't write long anymore because I feel like it's uninteresting. Something happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best compliment I can give you is the book was super fun and super quick to read. It was something I could, really do in a sitting. You mentioned a little bit ago that you asked your husband's permission, or you talked to him about the fact you were going to be writing about your marriage. And it feels like one of the hardest aspects of writing memoir, of course, is the fact that we write about other people and how to negotiate that. Sue Williams-Silverman, who's a teacher I think we both had at Vermont College of Fine Arts, she wrote somewhere something like, you should write whatever you want, and if people didn't want you to write about them, they should have been nicer to you.
Anne Lamott also says that, I think. I think Anne Lamott owns that, yeah.
Okay, so
Or Mary Carr. Somebody owns that, yeah.
So that's their line. I'm wondering how you negotiated the line for yourself.
So I don't think I do a great job of everything, but I actually think I do a good job of turning the camera on myself at different points of the book. So the first thing is that it was my husband was petrified to read the manuscript at the end because he thought I'd made him a villain. And I think I did anything but make him a villain. I think in the end it's like a love letter. But I think what I do at different points of the book is that I basically turn this camera on me and say, but I am also at fault. But I also played a part. But I'm also not so mature all the time. But I also can react poorly. And I think that for me as a memoir writer, that is crucial. That's crucial.
So I hear you saying being willing to put oneself kind of front and center as much as any other character is a way to kind of deal with this question of how to write about others.
I want to say that it's for me, it's like if you're going to reveal a character's underbelly, you have to reveal your own. If you're going to fault a character for their flaw, you have to do the same for yourself.
Has your husband read the book, and if so, how did he end up feeling about it?
So it was really hard to get him to read the manuscript. I married a Frenchman who's super smart, who doesn't like true stories, memoirs, documentaries, because he thinks he already knows the story. What's the point? So, that's what I was up against. He finally read it before I submitted it to a developmental editor at the publisher, and he was very surprised. First of all, that he wasn't portrayed as a villain. Second of all, at some of the memories I had, some of which we shared, some of which he didn't remember the same, and some of which he didn't remember anymore at all. And thirdly, he read it and said, after reading it all in one story, I just am surprised we made it out together to the other side. And I felt like for the first time, I let him into my head all these years later. Like really, into my head and into my heart in a way that maybe in the moment I wasn't able to because I wasn't mature enough. I wasn't dealing with it always the best way.
It's almost like the book brought you guys closer together.
Yeah. He's really proud of me. Not something he says often. Proud of what I've put into the world and these book tours that I've created for myself, and just really proud of me.
To shift gears once again and just ask you, one of the topics that comes up a lot in the book is your love for yoga and how you really kind of immerse yourself in that world. And you mentioned a little while ago the book landed. Just tell me more about that book.
So this goes back to a previous question, which I wanted to say, but wait. So that 90-something thousand word manuscript from 2016, this story, Places We Left Behind, was like the beginning of it, but I now have a second book called Landed, a yogi's memoir in pieces and poses, coming out in October 15th, which is kind of the other part of that story, but really after a pivotal conversation with another MFA friend from Vermont, Megan Vered, she said something to me that another mentor at Vermont College of Fine Arts had said, Barbara Hurd. Both of these women, after reading the stories up to the points that were written, said, I'm not sure if this is the right question. I'm not sure if this is the journey of your marriage or your own journey. I think you should think about the question you're trying to ask. Which made me realize that Places We Left Behind is our marital journey, but Landed is my journey, my search on and off a yoga mat, from the time we landed in Israel, like my third time trying to live there in 2011, exactly where Places We Left Behind ends. And it's a 7-year story that ends in 2018. It's my search for making peace with this place.
You also run something called and I want to make sure I get the Israel Writer Studio, and I wonder if you could tell me a bit about that.
So I teach creative writing. I teach what's called open genre, all levels, because I'm in a non-English speaking country and there aren't an abundance of memoir writers around, so I would never limit myself to just teaching memoir. While I could never comfortably teach poetry, I can say that to me poetry is all about word choice, and I've run a workshop on word choice. Like, I do teach to everybody. And I do 3 different things. I teach ongoing classes, I teach one-time workshops, and I host other writers who teach in my space. So a couple weeks after I get back, March 14th, I'm hosting Joan Legant. She's an American. She went to VCFA, exactly. An American fiction writer who's actually in Israel right now, and she's going to teach in my place at my studio. In April, I have a memoir writer, Judy Labenson, who's going to teach. In May, I have a children's book writer, Anna Levine. And in June, I have a poet named Jane Medved. So I have this schedule coming up because I don't have time to put workshops together, but I want to keep it fresh, to always have new blood coming in. And I love to share my space.
I think that Joan Legand is actually going to be a guest on the next season coming up.
Because she has a book coming out. Yeah, that's great.
Jennifer, I want to thank you so much for your time. It's been really a blast getting to talk with you.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to my conversation with memoirist Jennifer Lang. I'm Paul Zakshevsky. If you've enjoyed the show, then I hope you'll subscribe in Apple Podcasts. I'm always grateful for reviews and for sharing the show with friends. To get show notes and a transcript delivered to your inbox, please subscribe to my newsletter, The Book I Want to Write. It's at bookiwanttowrite.substack.com. Every week, I also publish short essays about writing mindset, developments in publishing, and more. If you're working on your own book you have to write, or you want to get started, maybe I can help. Find out more about me and my book coaching at bookiwantowrite.substack.com. That's bookiwantowrite.substack.com. And thanks for listening.